Now, the idea of a bounce rate has existed for a long time and has appeared on probably most of the dashboards I've ever seen. And yes, I've used it myself from time to time as well. However, it's one of those numbers that's quite divisive. It actually divides people. Some people hate the idea of using bounce rate, and some people use it all the time and they optimize against it. There's no right or wrong answer with this. I'm not going to kind of come out with some truth to uncover some mystery. The point here is that we're discussing the idea of bounce and engagement, and that's the first thing to explain, is that they are the inverse of each other. So if you have a 40% bounce rate, you have a 60% engagement rate. So every session can either be bounced or engaged, and that's when we talk about engagement rates or bounce rates, we're talking about how many sessions from the total sessions were engaged or did bounce. So now that we've got that idea of bounce and engagements being the inverse of each other, let's explain how they're calculated. Because the reason that it can be divisive is because some people don't understand the definition and thus are assuming if it goes up is a bad thing and if it goes down is a positive thing. And that's not always true. And this, to add fuel to the fire with this, to add confusion, Google Analytics 4 has got the idea of bounce rate just like the previous versions did, but it's changed the definition. So there's a metric in GA4 that's called the same thing, it's called bounce rate or engagement rate, but it's defined differently to what it did in the previous versions. So let's just run through a quick definition and let's then discuss. So first of all, we have to come up with some scenarios. So the first scenario is we have a session that contains one page view event, and they did not spend longer than 10 seconds on that page, and they did not log a conversion event. So in a sense, this user within this session saw one page and spent less than 10 seconds and didn't convert. A second scenario is that a user saw one page within the session. By the way, this works for apps as well, so we can replace page with screen in this example. So they saw one page or screen, and they either spent more than 10 seconds there, or they logged a conversion event. And the last scenario that we have to think about is just a session that contains more than one page view. And so let's say we've got those three scenarios. Looking at those three scenarios in the Universal Analytics world, those first two will be classed as a bounce, and thus the third one will be engaged. Universal Analytics didn't natively report on engagement as a metric, but it was just the inverse of bounce. The reason being is because Universal Analytics defined bounce as a single page view session. And now that's not necessarily good or bad. What if I written a blog, I tweeted a link to my blog saying, please go read my blog. They clicked the link, they read the blog, they clicked a link to go to your Instagram page to go follow you over there. That in Universal Analytics would be a bounce session, but not inherently bad. They've done kind of what you want them to do. And so this is the confusion, or maybe the controversy around bounce rate, of why people love it or hate it. It's kind of like Marmite. And this is because if you take pages like that, or marketing campaigns that are driving people to different pages or different reasons, and you've got pages like, your blog pages, and you've got acquisition pages too, and you average the averages, you're averaging everything all together, then what you're left with is this, unuseful number in the middle. And so bounce rate can be really useful. It's just when you average it in total, then it depends really on your website or your app how useful that can be. But anyway, let's go back to this and we look at the GA4 version. So GA4 has improved the definition slightly, but it's by no means perfect. It is not a perfect representation of engagement or bouncing. We can't track anything beyond this, but Google Analytics 4 is accounting for these two additional factors, whether or not they've converted and the engagement time on that page or screen. And so now when we look at this from a GA4 perspective, that first scenario there, where a user logged one page view or screen view event and they spent less than 10 seconds and they didn't convert, that is the new definition of a bounce. And if we look at that out of the total sessions, that's the bounce rate. The inverse of that is engagement rate. And so those other two things are classed as engaged. And the concept of engagement is actually something that's spread throughout the whole of the reporting sort of metrics within GA4. We've got average engagement rate, we've got the average engagement time, we've got engaged sessions per user. And so all of this stuff kind of filters through into all of our standard reports. But the important thing here is that engagement isn't necessarily good and bounce necessarily bad. I think there's some ambiguity, there's some grey area there. So when we're looking at this data, absolutely, we can assume, engagement rate, the more, the merrier. But the other thing to consider now is that we can directly control, in a sense, in a roundabout way, what that engagement means or how we work it out, or even the engagement rate. And that's because those two additional things that it accounts for, so conversion events and the 10-second timer, we can control. For example, I can go into my data stream settings within GA4, and I can see within there's a drop down where I can define that timer. I can go from 10 to 60 seconds in 10-second increments. So I can choose 30 seconds to be the timer before it counts as engaged. It defaults to 10 seconds, but that might be too short for you, in which case you might want to extend that. And the other thing we can control directly is the conversion events. So we know that we can turn any event into a conversion. We just mark each event as a conversion that we want to define as a conversion. And so the more events we mark as conversions, so in the free version of GA4, that's 30 conversion events, the more events we mark as a conversion, the higher the chance of our engagement being, because the more things they do on the website or the mobile application will count as a conversion and thus count as engaged. For example, and please don't do this, but if you marked the page view or screen view as a conversion, every single page view or screen view will be marked as a conversion, and thus pretty much every session to your website and mobile app will be engaged. And it makes the whole process of bounce and engagement redundant, right? Because we've just completely washed it out. And so this is where the more, or as we change our conversion events, it changes that definition of engagement. And so this is a kind of a living, breathing thing where sometimes we might mark a couple of events as conversions for a period of time and then we take them off, especially if you're running a temporary campaign. So just to wrap it up, bounce rate is the inverse of engagement rate. So one is the inverse of the other. They are just a percentage of total sessions. So if I've got 20 engaged sessions out of 40 sessions, then my engagement rate is 50%, and thus my bounce rate is 50%. And the way that we define them is a combination of understanding pages or screens per session, engagement time, and whether or not they converted. And we roll that all up into this idea of engagement and bounce. You don't have to regurgitate this technical definition, absolutely not. I just wanted to explain a bit of the background around these metrics and how they've changed into the GA4 world and how they work. I've linked off to some documentation there, so feel free to go through in your own time if you wanted to dig a bit deeper. But I hope that's helped. I hope that's put some context around this number of bouncing or bounce rates and engagement rates in the GA4 world. Yeah, and I hope that can be useful for you. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.